Hi there. You are listening to the Common Action Forum's monthly podcast, where we look for alternative narratives to shape a better world. I am Tristan Torrejon. It's Monday, the 2nd of August, and for this first edition, we want to take a look at the state of global geopolitics, setting our eyes on topics like the COVID-19 pandemic, the Pegasus spyware scandal, and the current circumstances in the Middle East. And for that, we've got Mr. Wadah Khanfar here with us. Good day, Mr. Khanfar. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Wadah Khanfar is the president and co-founder of the Common Action Forum. Boasting an outstanding career in journalism, Mr. Khanfar is former Director General of Al Jazeera, where, during his tenure, he led its transformation from a regional news source into the prestigious international news network we know today. So, Mr. Khanfar, in the analysis you wrote last year for CAF's Metacrisis magazine, you picture the pandemic as a metacrisis of sorts. In your own words, one of those peculiar moments in history that see the disintegration of a current order. A few months have passed since then. Has your analysis changed?
In fact, my analysis did not change as far as the significance of the crisis, which is metacrisis. In my opinion, this is one of the most important moments in the last 2 centuries where the humanity is facing existential questions, existential issues, a result of some severe process that the humanity has evolved into during the last few decades. And that is in particular materialistic in nature, greed, and the fact that the humanity is searching for ways to maximize profit in a material sense and to maximize utility of the planet Earth without taking into consideration the necessity to create balance and the fact that this is our home where all of us should be very careful in order not to lose. Are we benefiting from this? Are we contemplating? In my opinion, we are not. To a large extent, the centers of power, and I mean governments and big corporations, those who own basically the economy, are going back to the norm, which is more and more utility of this globe and ignoring the pandemic and its impact and the fact that the planet, in a way or another, when it becomes sick, we all become sick. And the fact that we need really to reconsider a new narrative, a new approach, new paradigm of thinking about ourselves and others in this world. We need to see how could we first create balance with the globe, but also we need to create that balance within the human family itself, where we have witnessed that a pandemic that started in China eventually became international. And this is not teaching a lot of lessons about how could we, all of us together, save ourselves, not by saving those who are rich and wealthy and can afford vaccine, for example, and ignoring those who cannot afford. Until today, this lesson is not yet learned. And in my opinion, we need more and more of great voices of people expressing their ideals and values in order to reach a moment of balance within the human family and within as well the planet altogether.
And now to the Middle East. The recent events in Gaza have shown us yet again how massacring civil population can be dismissed by many as a standard form of conflict. Do you think Palestine somehow embodies the tensions between the ethical and the geopolitical that characterize global processes?
I do believe that the Palestinian issue is again another symptom of the imbalance in the power structure in the world. I do believe that the Western inclination towards power in a pragmatic sense, power that is not balanced by justice and equality, has been one of the most important tools of creating this kind of apartheid state in the Middle East and Israel, and also the fact that it has been given impunity and given exceptionalism to do a lot against civilians. Most of them are basically not involved in any kind of violent attack against Israel, but eventually the land is occupied. And this concept of occupation, which is contrary to international law, has not been taken serious. Eventually, the American foreign policy in the region, and to a large extent, some European countries as well, have been concentrating on the so-called terrorism rather than concentrating on ending the occupation and creating equality and justice between the Palestinians and the Israelis. This is unfortunately a reason why this conflict comes back always to us in order to create this chaos that we see in the Middle East in large and between the Palestinians and the Israelis as well. So if we are going to look at what happened during the last few weeks, what is positive about it? For the first time, the Palestinian narrative has been heard, at least partially through social media, and people start to see that the values of equality and justice, the values of ending occupation and giving liberty to the people to decide their future are important to be achieved before we even speak about a process that could achieve eternal and long-lasting peace in the region.
And talking again about transitions, it's been 10 years since the spark that ignited the Arab Springs. Beyond their failures or successes, the structural conditions that led to these revolutions not only prevail in most countries, but are actually getting worse. And that's just partly due to the pandemic. With a 10-year perspective, really, how successful were they, in your opinion?
I do believe that the Arab Spring is a continuous process. It has not ended yet. I think it did start in 2011. And the first phase of it was suppressed by counter-revolutionary forces in the region and the blessing of the American foreign policy that did not favor the new forces that were elected to govern Egypt and the rest of the Arab Spring countries. And they felt more comfortable with the old style of governance, which they summarize it by saying we put security above freedom and democracy. And this, of course, is not going to achieve security in the long run. So the new dictatorships that took over the Arab countries actually failed in producing alternative. And they are even much worse than the previous regimes that people revolted against in 2011. The new regimes have had very clear approach to the concept of freedom and democracy by rejecting it and putting anyone who might think of it in jail. Now we have more than 60,000 political prisoners in Egypt. We have a civil war, as you know, where 10 million refugees cannot go back home in Syria. We have also more than 600,000 people massacred by the regime in Syria. And we have a civil war in Yemen. We have many other complications in Libya and so on. So the issue is the counter-revolutionary forces and the blessings of the international powers actually did create much more complicated situation. The second phase of the Arab Spring, I foresee, is coming. I don't know when, but it is coming because all reasons to reject the current reality exist at this moment in time. Added to it, the failure of the state to deliver. During the pandemic, most of the Arab states could not really do much to secure proper vaccination, for example, and to create proper health care to the people, beside the fact that economically, their policies, which are to a large extent classified as the most corrupt regimes in the world, have led as well to a decline in economy. So we don't have only dictatorship and counter-revolutions, but also we have decline in economy, decline in services, and to a large extent, almost collapse of the current Arab state. A lot of them are failing states, and you cannot even describe them as stable or secure or prosperous at all. And because of that, I project during the next phase another revolution in the Arab world, and that could become even much more extreme and violent than the first one, because people thought that by protesting peacefully, they did not achieve what they have hoped to achieve, and their hope for democracy was murdered, and they right now don't have much to lose, actually.
But what about Tunisia, though? Arguably the only example of success out of that first phase. We just saw President Said assuming government after sacking the prime minister. What's your take on that situation?
Okay. The situation in Tunisia is an example of the continuous conflict that is happening in the Arab world, the transition into a phase whereby democracy could be established. As you know, democracy in the Arab world does not have deep roots, even in Tunisia, which was actually the first Arab country to revolt against the dictatorship. But currently, the counter-revolutions in the Arab world, who succeeded in many countries in suppressing the forces that led the Arab Spring, have also influenced Tunisia. So the current situation in Tunisia, although it has been in a way or another introduced as constitutional, what the president has done, which is freezing the parliament and taking over the state, basically, in most of its functions, including becoming the attorney general, the president himself. That, in my opinion, is another example of how counter-revolutions are pushing against deep process of democracy. Will that succeed or not? I don't think so. It will interrupt the process in Tunisia, definitely. It has already interrupted democracy in Tunisia, and it is going to create another situation, another Arab country, where the economy is not functioning properly. It will become worse, and where the services delivered by the government will be worsened, because now the political conflict is becoming much more higher and much more deeper, unfortunately, in Tunisia.
And last but not least, Amnesty and the NGO Forbidden Stories have recently exposed the extent to which the Pegasus system has been used to surveil politicians, journalists, and activists all around the world. But what do you think? Is it even possible to aspire to regulate the spyware industry when it's actual governments that are the main clients?
What I have seen from the latest revelations about the cybersecurity issue, especially the Pegasus scandal, in my opinion, is another example of how corrupt states basically are using this against journalists, against political activists, in order to suppress this move towards democracy. This is eventually going to create resentment against these states and these actors. They're not going to succeed, definitely. They might be able to interrupt, they might be able to put pressure on some activists and journalists, but to a large extent, what we have seen recently is another example of how authoritarian regimes are using all kinds of tricks, including very dirty, illegal kind of means, in order to interrupt the situation, especially in this part of the world, in the Arab world, and in actually various parts of the South. The political South, in my opinion, is now under this kind of attack. So we need, as people who defend democracy and human rights, to be unified against this. It should not only be condemned we should aspire to incriminate it, to expose it. And the example of 14 news agencies coming together to work with Amnesty International on this issue is a great example that should be encouraged. This is one of the most superb investigative journalism that was done during the last few years, and we should congratulate them, and we should always come together in order to expose all kinds of means to suffocate the process of transparency and process of democracy, and to dismantle this myth, the hegemonic nature of this modern state equipped with high tech. And unfortunately, this high tech, it should have been for the benefit of the humans. But right now we see it more and more becoming an obstacle in front of the human progress, because the state that has this tendency to maximize power does not know any limit in order to get more control and to fight against those who are demanding much better freedoms.
Thank you very much for joining us and for your insights, Mr. Khanfar. And that's that for this edition. There will be a new edition of CAF's podcast next month. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, send us an email. The address is caf@commonactionforum.net. I am Tristan Torrejón. This edition was produced by the Common Action Forum team in Madrid, thanks to Irene López and Sofía Golke. Special thanks to Mr. Wadah Khanfar for joining us today, and overall, thank you for listening. Until next time.